Welcome to Aircraft, your gateway to thrilling HFY sci-fi stories where humanity stands strong among the stars. Here, you'll experience epic encounters with alien civilizations, moments of human courage, intelligence, and the unstoppable spirit that makes humanity unique. Every story on this channel is narrated by a real human voice, not AI, bringing you a more authentic and immersive storytelling experience. If you love sci-fi adventures and stories where humanity proves its worth in the universe, you're in the right place. Let's start the story.
Every species in the known galaxy has a story they tell their children about the Vareth Academy. The Salvani tell it as a warning. The Drelkai tell it as a prayer. The Move Collective doesn't tell stories. They transmit raw memory clusters, but even their oldest archives dedicate 17 terabytes to the Academy's founding, its graduates, its wars, its gods. None of those stories mention humans. That's not an accident. That's policy. Because the last time a human walked through the Vareth gates, 3-star systems changed hands. One ancient empire collapsed from the inside, and the Academy's Dean of Strategic Studies resigned, citing, and this is the exact translation from High Salvani, an inability to continue teaching in good conscience after witnessing what a 23-year-old from a Class 12 death world considers an acceptable solution to a hostage situation. That was 60 years ago. The human graduated with highest honors. The hostages all lived. So did the human. Nobody talks about what happened to the people who took them. This is not that story. This is the one that came after. The one the Academy's records will eventually seal, classify, and bury in a restricted archive that requires 3 senior faculty signatures and a documented psychological evaluation to access. This is the story of the day the admissions board received an application from a species they'd already decided, collectively and in writing, to never admit again, and approved it anyway, by unanimous vote. Nobody on that board could explain why afterward, not in any language that made sense. One Salvani administrator, 1,200 years old, who had reviewed 4 million applications across her career, simply said, in a voice that her colleagues described as the tone she uses when she's already accepted something she doesn't understand yet, the scores were correct. The scores were all correct. Savathro processed information in layers. This was a Drelkai thing. Not unique to her, not a personality quirk, but a fundamental feature of Drelkai neurology that every xenobiology textbook in the explored galaxy described in approximately the same way. The Drelkai mind operates through simultaneous parallel processing tracks, each running independent assessments that eventually collapse into a single consensus position. What the textbooks did not mention, because no textbook writer had ever asked a Drelkai to describe it from the inside, was that this meant Savathro was almost always running 3 or 4 completely separate emotional responses to any given situation at once, and the one that won was usually not the one she expected. On the morning the new student arrived, her layers went like this. Layer 1, Administrative Interest. The new student's file had been flagged with a designation Savathro had never seen applied to a living applicant, only to historical case studies and once to a weapons system that the Academy had helped develop and later helped destroy. She was curious, in the way a cartographer is curious about a coastline that doesn't match any map. Layer 2, Professional Caution. She was the Academy's senior integration counselor. Her job was to ease new students into the institution's social architecture. She had done this for 214 cycles. She had handled Salvani nobility who considered themselves above instruction, moved cluster fragments experiencing their first individual consciousness, and once memorably, a Harith who had arrived believing the Academy was a military target and had taken 3 weeks to accept that it was, in fact, a school. She was good at this. She had protocols. Layer 3, the one she was least comfortable acknowledging, something that registered in her secondary scent processing lobe as the chemical signature of anticipation. Not the kind she felt before a difficult counseling session. The kind she felt before something she didn't have a category for yet. She was standing in the Academy's reception atrium when the shuttle docked. The atrium was designed to impress. Everything at Vareth was designed to impress. The architecture was a collaboration between 7 species, built across 4 centuries, and it showed in the way the corridors shifted gravity subtly as you walked them, or the way the central spire caught light from 3 different star sources and scattered it in colors that no single planet sky had ever produced. Students arrived here and stood very still for a few seconds, almost all of them just processing. Sabathrow had watched thousands of arrivals. The airlock cycled. The door opened. The human walked in. She was Sabathrow's Layer 1 mind began cataloging, smaller than expected. The file had listed height in standard units, and Sabathrow had calculated it, but calculation and observation were different things. The human stood perhaps 1.7 Drelkai, arm lengths tall, bipedal, bilateral symmetry, forward-facing visual organs, the flat facial structure, and bare skin that always struck Sabathrow as slightly unfinished, like a sculpture someone had abandoned before adding the interesting parts. Brown skin, darker around the joints. Hair, that extraordinary human phenomenon of growing dead protein from a skull for no clear thermoregulatory reason, pulled back in a way that looked deliberate. A single bag slung over one shoulder. A jacket that had been repaired in 4 places Sabathrow could count from this distance. She stopped in the middle of the atrium. She looked up. She looked at the light. The scattered prismatic light from the central spire, the kind that had made a Salvani Duchess weep openly on arrival and cause a Mauve cluster fragment to stand motionless for 6 full minutes before its consensus track caught up with the input. The human looked at it for approximately 2 seconds. Then she looked down, pulled a small device from her jacket pocket, checked something on it, put it back, and walked towards Sabathrow with the expression of someone who has a list of things to do and is working through it. "Your counselor Sabathrow," she said. "Not a question. I'm Devi. I'm supposed to check in with you." All 4 of Sabathrow's processing layers attempted to respond simultaneously and produced a brief silence instead. "Yes," she said, after a moment. "Welcome to the Verith Academy." "I'm Yes. I'll show you to your quarters." "Great." Devi looked around the atrium once more, not with wonder, not with the speechless reverence Sabathrow was accustomed to, but with the focused attention of someone assessing the dimensions of a space they might need to navigate in a hurry. "Is there a commissary open? I've been in transit for 30 hours, and the shuttle food was—" She made a gesture with her hand that seemed to substitute for the rest of the sentence. "The shuttle food was. There is a— Yes. We can arrange something." "Excellent." She smiled. It was a strange expression. The Drelkai facial structure could produce the mechanical equivalent, but it didn't mean the same thing, and the human smile had always unsettled Sabathrow in a way she'd never successfully filed under a clean category. It showed teeth. Drelkai showed teeth as a threat display. The human was showing teeth as a signal of goodwill, comfort. It was objectively both things at once, and Sabathrow's Layer 3 track registered the chemical signature of anticipation again, stronger this time. "I've heard a lot about this place," Devi said, falling into step beside her. "Most of it from my grandmother." Sabathrow's Layer stuttered. "Your grandmother." Devi was reading a corridor map on her device as she walked. "She went here about 60 years ago. She mentioned it sometimes. Said the strategic theory curriculum was excellent, but the faculty needed better survival instincts." She glanced up, and there was something in her expression, not humor exactly, or not only humor, something layered. She said the same thing about most people, to be honest. It wasn't personal. Sabathrow processed this in parallel across all 4 tracks. The human who had walked through the Verith gates 60 years ago. The one the records were sealed about. The one 3-star systems were still, in small ways, dealing with the aftermath of. "Your grandmother," Sabathrow said carefully, "attended this institution. Graduated," Devi said. "Highest honors, I think." She was modest about it. She turned a corner that Sabathrow had been about to indicate. She already knew the layout. The admissions board, were they surprised by my application? I know the human admission policy has been complicated. "The vote," Sabathrow said, "was unanimous." Devi nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "Grandma figured it would be." The academy had 1,143 students from 37 species. By the end of Devi's first day, approximately 600 of them knew she was there. By the end of her second day, all of them did. This was not because of anything she did. She attended her orientation sessions. She sat through the placement assessments with the focused, unhurried attention that Sabathrow was already beginning to recognize as her default mode. Not bored, not distracted, just present in a way that was somehow more complete than most students managed. She ate in the commissary. She nodded at people. She did not introduce herself to anyone who didn't speak first. It was the scores. The Academy's placement assessments were designed by a committee that included the three greatest strategic minds in the explored galaxy. One philosopher who had died 2 centuries ago, but whose theoretical framework still structured half the exam, and a Salvani mathematician whose contribution to the section on probabilistic modeling was considered by everyone who understood it to be essentially unfair. Students took the assessments over 3 days. The results were confidential, shared only with the student and their assigned counselor. The results were also inevitably gossiped about. This was a school for the galaxy's most gifted minds. They were very good at inferring things from partial information. What they inferred by the end of day 2 was that the human had scored in a range that the assessment framework described in technical terms as architecturally anomalous, meaning the system had flagged her responses not because they were wrong, but because they didn't fit any of the solution paths the framework had been designed to recognize. She had, apparently, answered 3 questions in the strategic modeling section using approaches that the assessment's review algorithm had never encountered in 200 years of operation. The algorithm had taken 11 minutes to decide whether to mark them correct. It marked them correct. Word got around. Sabathrow heard about it from 2 different faculty members before she'd finished her morning nutrition cycle. Professor Valeron, who taught advanced military doctrine and had the bearing of someone who had decided decades ago that nothing would ever surprise him again, stopped her in the corridor outside the curriculum offices and said, without preamble, the human, "What do you know about her family?" "That information is confidential," Sabathrow said. Her grandmother, Valeron said, attended this institution. "That information is also Sabbath." He looked at her with a particular expression of someone choosing words with the care of someone defusing something. The question on the assessment that the algorithm flagged. Section 7, Scenario 4. The one about the Keth corridor blockade simulation. He paused. The answer she gave. "I've been teaching that scenario for 40 cycles. In 40 cycles, no student has found that solution. One graduate found it, afterward, in a post-session analysis. One." He stopped again. "Her grandmother found it during the session. The records are sealed, but I was a junior faculty member when she was here. I was in the room." He looked at Sabathrow as if she might have an answer he couldn't find himself. The granddaughter found a different solution. A better one. Sabathrow's Layer 3 track produced the anticipation signal again. Louder. "She's a student," Sabathrow said. "She should be treated as one." Velhoron nodded slowly. "Of course." He didn't move for a moment. "Then, does she know what her grandmother did?" "After graduation." "She knows her grandmother attended." "But does she know she's a student?" Sabathrow said again. Firmer this time. Because this was the part of her job she was actually trained for. The part where the institution's fascination with a student became a weight the student hadn't agreed to carry. "She's been here 2 days. Let her be a student." Velhoron conceded this with a slight inclination of his head. He walked away. He stopped once at the corridor junction and looked back. "The jacket she was wearing," he said, "when she arrived. The repair's on it." Sabathrow waited. "I've seen that repair technique before. The thermal stitching on the left collar seam." He paused. "It's not a human technique. It's Harith field repair work. Someone who knew Harith's survival craft repaired that jacket." He paused once more. "Her grandmother spent 14 years in the Harith border systems after graduation." He left. Sabathrow stood in the corridor for a moment, all 4 processing layers doing something she didn't have a clean classification for. Then, she went to check on her student. She found Devi in the Academy library, not in the accessible stacks, in the restricted archive anteroom, which required a counselor's clearance to enter and which students were not supposed to be able to locate without a guided tour that was scheduled for the end of the first week. Debbie was not inside. She was sitting on a bench outside the anteroom door, reading something on her device, with the slightly tired patience of someone who has tried a door, found it locked, and decided to simply wait to see what happens next. "How did you find this room?" Sabathrow asked. Debbie looked up. "The corridor geometry," she said. "The public sections of the library don't add up to the building's footprint. There's about 400 square meters unaccounted for. Given the ventilation patterning and the fact that the cleaning drones route around this corridor rather than through it, The most likely explanation is a restricted section. She tilted her head slightly. Is my grandmother's file in there? Sabathrow's 4 layers attempted a response. The restricted archive contains historical records of I'm not asking to read it, Devi said. The device went back in her pocket. I know it's sealed. Grandma told me it was sealed. She thought that was funny. A brief pause. She thought a lot of things were funny. Sabathrow sat down on the bench beside her. It was an impulse, not a counselor's calculated move, but something that came from the Layer 3 track, the one she was least comfortable with. What did she tell you about this place? She asked. Debbie thought about this for a moment. Not performing thought, actually thinking. Sabathrow could see the processing in her expression, the way the forward-facing eyes moved very slightly upward and to the left. She said the Academy teaches you to think about every problem in terms of resources, leverage, and acceptable loss. She paused. She said the hardest thing she learned here wasn't in any of the curriculum. It was watching really brilliant minds from really advanced civilizations work through every angle of an impossible problem. Another pause, shorter, and never once consider that the impossibility itself might be the thing that needs solving. Sabathrow processed this. She said humans are annoying to teach, Devi added, with the same tone she'd used to note that the shuttle food was bad. Because we keep trying to solve the problem instead of the exercise. Is that what you intend to do? Sabathrow asked. Solve the problem instead of the exercise. Debbie looked at her. Fully looked, the forward-facing visual organs making direct contact, which was not a thing Drelkai did to each other without specific social context, and which always registered physiologically as a mild startlement in Sabathrow's nervous system. I intend, Debbie said, to graduate. She said it the way someone says something that sounds simple and means several other things that they've decided not to elaborate on. Sabathrow's Layer 3 track filled the library corridor with a scent of anticipation so strongly that she was mildly surprised Devi couldn't detect it. Maybe she could. She didn't say anything. She just stood up, picked up her bag, and nodded at the sealed archive door once, not reverently, more like acknowledging something, and walked back toward the student quarters. Sabathrow sat on the bench for a moment after she left. The cleaning drones routed around the corridor the way they always did. The archive door stayed sealed. Somewhere inside it, a 60-year-old file sat classified and silent, containing whatever a 23-year-old human had done to make 3-star systems rearrange themselves. Her granddaughter was 22. Sabathrow stood up, smoothed her counselor's sash, and went to update her integration notes. She wrote, in the space reserved for initial assessment, standard orientation proceeding. Student appears oriented. Recommend monitoring. Then, she deleted monitoring and wrote engagement. Then, she sat there for a moment longer. Then, she wrote in the smaller text field below, which was technically for administrative use only, and which she had never in 214 cycles used for anything personal, she knows something she isn't saying yet. So do we. It might be the same thing. The Academy had a saying, not official, not printed anywhere, but the kind of thing that survived because it was true enough to keep being repeated. You don't know what you're made of until the simulation kills you. The Tactical Simulation Hall occupied the entire east wing of the Academy's 3rd tier. It was by any measure the most sophisticated training environment in the explored galaxy. 7 species had contributed to its architecture. 3 more had contributed to its AI modeling systems. The Salvani, who'd funded the most recent expansion, had stipulated that the difficulty parameters should be set according to the original founder specifications, which had been written in an era when the founders believed that if a student couldn't survive a simulation, the simulation was too easy, and that the purpose of failure was not to discourage students but to show them precisely and without sentiment the outer edge of what they currently were. The outer edge moved. That was the whole point. Sabathrow didn't usually attend simulations. It wasn't her role, but she found herself in the observation gallery on Devi's 3rd week because Professor Velharan had sent her a message that said, simply, first group assessment. You should see this. She sat in the back of the gallery, behind the faculty observers. Below, in the simulation space, 15 students had been sorted into a team for the assessment. Devi was among them. The scenario loaded. Sabathrow read the parameters on the faculty display. A stranded convoy in contested space. three hostile forces with conflicting interests, limited fuel reserves, a damaged communications array, and a civilian population of approximately 9,000 that every tactical model indicated was unextractable before the hostile forces converged. The scenario had been run 1,100 times across the Academy's history. The success criteria required extracting at least 60% of the civilian population. The record was 73%, held by a Salvani graduate who was now a fleet admiral and who still occasionally returned to the Academy to give lectures about the simulation and what it had taught him. The historical average was 41%. In the simulation space, the 15 students began running assessments. Savithro watched them through the observation window. This was the part she found interesting, not the tactics, which she was not trained to evaluate, but the social dynamics. How groups organized under pressure. Who deferred to whom? Who pushed back? There was a Salvani student named Tareth. She'd met him during his integration counseling. Tall, severe, the kind of intelligence that expressed itself as total certainty. He'd already positioned himself at the central display, running probability models. Two other students had organized themselves as his analysts without needing to be asked. A natural gravitational center. Devi was standing slightly to the side. Not excluded, she was part of the team's loose cluster, but not in the center either. Savithro watched her. She was looking at a different display, the one showing fuel consumption projections, which most of the team hadn't engaged with yet, because the tactical problem seemed more pressing. 3 corridors, Tareth announced to the team. His translated voice carried the clipped confidence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room and who had never had any reason to update this belief. We extract through Corridor 7 with fighter escort. We sacrifice the outer settlements to consolidate extraction capacity. 61% survival. That exceeds the success threshold. Several students nodded. The 2 analysts began running the numbers. Devi kept looking at the fuel display. The fuel calculation's wrong, she said. Not loudly. She said it the way she said most things, at a volume calibrated to reach the relevant people without performing for the room. Tareth looked at her. The fuel calculation accounts for the escort trajectory, not accounting for the gravity drift from the gas giant in Sector 9. She turned from the display. The convoy's already been pulled 0.3 degrees off optimal. By the time you run the escort to Corridor 7, the fuel deficit puts 3 of the civilian transports short of the extraction point. A beat of silence. In the observation gallery, 2 faculty members straightened in their chairs. The drift is within standard margin. One of Devi's teammates, a Drelkai student, young, clearly brilliant, said. He was running his own numbers as he spoke. Savithro recognized the processing expression. He was checking her math, not contradicting it. Not at this ship mass, Devi said. The transports are loaded to 117% capacity. The margin doesn't hold above 110. Another beat. The young Drelkai students' mandibles did the thing they did when the parallel processing tracks reached a consensus that the tracks hadn't anticipated. She's correct, he said, quietly. The margin doesn't hold. Tareth's expression didn't change in any way that registered on his face. But he looked at the fuel display for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds was a long time for a Salvani. They were engineered over millennia for rapid tactical assessment. 3 seconds meant something had interrupted the usual flow. Then, Corridor 7 is non-viable, he said, and to his credit, he said it without decoration. He looked at Devi. What's the alternative? Devi turned back to her display. What followed, Savithro would think about for a long time afterward. Not the solution itself. She wasn't a tactician, and the specific mechanics of what Devi proposed were beyond her training to fully evaluate, but the way it happened. Because Devi didn't take over. She didn't seize the center of the room. She stayed where she was at the side display, and she started talking through the fuel drift and what it meant for the hostile force convergence timeline, and the team that had already organized itself around Tareth, started shifting not away from Tareth, but toward the problem, and Tareth started incorporating what she was saying into his own modeling, and the Drelkai students started running parallel tracks. And at some point, Savithro couldn't have identified clearly. The team stopped having a center and became something more like a network, all of them contributing, all of them following a thread that Devi had handed them without ever picking it up herself. The simulation ran. The result loaded. 89%. The observation gallery went very quiet. Veleron, seated 2 rows ahead of Savathro, did not make a sound. He was looking at the result display. His expression was the one he described to her in the corridor, the one from 40 cycles of teaching the same scenario without a student cracking it. She watched him process the number. Watch him look at the simulation space, where Devi was reviewing the fuel projections with the Drelkai student with the same unhurried focus she'd had in the atrium on day 1, checking something off an internal list. 89%. The record had been 73. Savathro became aware that she was producing the anticipation scent marker again, and that it was noticeable. She made a conscious effort to regulate it. She didn't solve it, said the faculty member seated next to Velharon. His name was Orith, and he taught political systems. He sounded slightly dazed. She handed the team the piece they needed and let them solve it. She barely touched the central display. No, Velharon said. Her grandmother, Orith started. Her grandmother took over the room, Velharon said. He was still watching Devi through the observation glass. I was there. She was extraordinary. She took the room in about 4 minutes and solved the problem herself, and it was one of the most remarkable things I have ever watched. He paused. This is different. Orith looked at the result display. 89%. Different how? Velharon didn't answer for a moment. Then, her grandmother made the team better than they could have been without her. This one made the team better than she could have been without them. He stopped again. I don't know which is more. He stopped a 3rd time. Left the sentence where it was. In the simulation space, Devi was saying something to Tarith. Savathro couldn't hear it through the glass, but she could see Tarith's response, the slight, controlled expression of someone receiving information they hadn't asked for and finding it relevant. He said something back. Devi nodded. Tarith looked at the result display. His expression did a thing Savathro had never seen a Salvani expression do. Something that resolved slowly from assessment into something without a clean Salvani classification. He inclined his head toward her. Not a bow. The Salvani didn't bow. Something more specific than that. Word got around faster this time. By dinner, the 89% was general knowledge. By the following morning, it had acquired a second story attached to it, that the human had calculated the gas giant's drift correction in her head, without a display, while standing at the wrong console. This was an exaggeration, Savathro confirmed from the observation records, but it was a small exaggeration, and the exaggeration was less interesting than the truth. The Drelkai student who'd run the parallel tracks, his name was Vethorin, and he was considered by the faculty to be among the top 5 most promising students the Academy had seen in the last 2 decades, sought Savathro out during her office hours. He sat down across from her with the careful posture of someone who has something to say and hasn't decided on the shape of it yet. She gave me the thread, he said, after a moment. The drift calculation. She handed it to me and let me run it. His mandibles moved in the pattern that, for a Drelkai, indicated multiple processing tracks still working. She didn't need me to run it. She'd already run it. I could see it in the sequence she presented. And, Savathro said, she needed the team to have run it. He paused. Because if only she had done it, Tarith's model would have incorporated it as a correction. But if I ran it, if a Drelkai running parallel tracks confirmed it, it entered the model as a consensus finding. It changed how the whole team weighted it. Another pause. She was doing social engineering in a tactical simulation. At the same time, his processing track's expression intensified. I don't have a classification for that. Savathro thought of Velharon's unfinished sentence, the one he'd left sitting in the observation gallery. Have you spoken with her? She asked. I tried. Vethorin's mandibles stilled. I asked her about the fuel drift calculation, how she'd seen it before anyone else. He paused. She said she'd been on convoys before, and the gravity drift issue comes up a lot. He stared at Savathro. She said it comes up a lot. The implication settled in the room between them. She'd been on convoys. Real ones, not simulations. Savathro thought about the jacket with the Harith Field Repair stitching, about a grandmother who'd spent 14 years in the border systems after graduation, about a granddaughter who knew convoy mechanics from experience. She was 22 years old. She's a student, Savathro said. The 3rd time she'd said it in 2 weeks. It was starting to feel like a thing she was saying to herself as much as to the person in front of her. Of course, Vethorin said. He stood. He looked at the door. She made the team better than the sum of us. I want to understand how she did it. He paused with the precise precision of someone who has found a curiosity they intend to pursue. I think that's worth understanding. He left. Savathro sat in her office for a moment. The integration notes were open on her desk. The field for social integration progress was blinking. She wrote, "Student has formed initial network connections within first 3 weeks. Integration proceeding at unusual rate." She paused. Then she wrote in the administrative text field again, "The unusual rate is not anxiety." I checked. She found Devi in the corridor outside the restricted archive again. Not on the bench this time. Standing, looking at the door with her arms crossed, and an expression that Savathro still hadn't successfully classified. There was something in it that was assessment, and something that was patience, and something else she was still working on. "You keep coming back here," Savathro said. "The corridor has good acoustics," Devi said. "Then, I'm not trying to get in. I told you." "I know." Savathro stood beside her, not in a counselor's position, just beside her, both of them looking at the door. "What do you want from it?" Devi was quiet for a moment. "She never told me what she did," she said. "After. I knew she'd been here. I knew she graduated. I know what she did in the border systems because some of it isn't classified, and she talked about it when she was toward the end." A breath. "But the thing she did here, the reason the file's sealed." She just said. Devi's voice didn't change in tone, but the pacing shifted just slightly. She just said it was the last time she saw the problem by herself. And she wanted me to understand that before I came. Savathro processed this across all 4 layers simultaneously. They all reached the same place. "I think," she said carefully, "that the file is sealed because what she did was considered, by the faculty at the time, to be a strategic action of significant consequence. Not dangerous, but consequential in ways they hadn't anticipated." Devi nodded once, like she'd suspected. "The 3-star systems," Savathro continued. "The reorganization afterward. She didn't fight a war. She stopped. Found the right words. She solved a negotiation problem, one that had been ongoing for 90 years. She found a thread, handed it to the right people, and let them run it." Devi turned to look at her. The forward-facing visual organs, the direct contact, the mild startlement in Savathro's nervous system. "She taught you," Devi said. Not a question. Savathro's processing layers did something complicated and landed all 4 of them in the same unexpected place. "She was a student," she said, and this time it didn't feel like something she was saying to herself. It felt like something she'd been waiting to say. Devi looked at the sealed door one more time. Something moved through her expression, not grief exactly, but adjacent to it, the way a star and its shadow are adjacent. "Okay," she said quietly, to the door, or to herself, or to someone who wasn't in the corridor anymore. Then she picked up her bag and turned back toward the academy's lit corridors. "I have a systems theory seminar in 20 minutes, she said. "Professor Velharon. I'm told he's very good. He is," Savathro said. "He'll challenge you." "Good." The edge of that strange smile, the one that showed teeth, the one that meant both threat and warmth simultaneously. "I came here to be challenged." She walked away, her footsteps even and unhurried in the corridor, her jacket still repaired in 4 places. The Harrods stitching on the left collar seemed catching the light from the wall panels as she turned the corner, and was gone. Savathro stood outside the archive door for a moment longer. The cleaning drones routed around the corridor, the way they always did. She went back to her office and opened the integration notes. The administrative text field was still there, with her 2 previous entries. She added a third. She came here to do what her grandmother couldn't teach her directly. "I think the academy is going to find out what that is before she does. I think we should let it happen." 6 weeks into the semester, the academy ran its first real crisis. Not a simulation, not an assessment, a real one, the kind that arrived without a loading screen, and without parameters, and without the quiet professional hum of the observation gallery above. It started with a communications blackout in the Drelkai Embassy District on the Academy's lower tier, a small administrative section that housed diplomatic attaches from 7 systems, most of whom were here for the annual Strategic Council review that coincided with the start of the academic year. The blackout lasted 12 minutes and was attributed to a power relay failure. The power relay was repaired. The communications came back, but 4 of the diplomatic teams didn't. They were still physically present. The Academy's internal sensors confirmed that 31 diplomats were located across 2 rooms in the embassy district, alive, uninjured. But they were not communicating. Not on any frequency. Not in any language. They were waiting. And the entity they were waiting for had sent one message before the blackout, in Old Salvani, which nobody except 2 elderly faculty members could read fluently, and which took 47 minutes to translate fully, during which time the Academy's administration went through a very compressed version of the stages of crisis management. The message, fully translated, said, "The Reth Compact sends regards to the Verith Academy and its distinguished faculty. We are aware that the Academy maintains a policy of institutional neutrality in galactic disputes. We are aware that this neutrality is of significant value to many parties and that most of those parties would prefer it to remain intact. We are using this awareness as leverage. We require the transfer of the Academy's strategic modeling archive, 300 years of compiled tactical assessments, battle outcome analyses, and diplomatic resolution frameworks within 48 hours. In exchange, the diplomatic personnel currently in our custody will be released unharmed. We expect the Academy's leadership to understand that this is not a negotiation. It is a schedule." Sabathrow read the translation 3 times. The Reth Compact, a faction she knew from a library's accessible political archives, a loose confederation of systems that had spent 40 years building toward exactly the kind of leverage they were currently exercising patiently, without drawing significant attention, which in retrospect everyone should have seen coming, and which nobody had. The Academy's dean, an ancient Salvani named Velsath who had administered the institution through 6 previous crises of varying severity, called an emergency faculty meeting. Sabathrow attended because she'd been asked. She sat in the back. She listened. The faculty argued. The dean was quiet. The arguments took the form that arguments in a room full of the galaxy's most brilliant minds always took. Comprehensive, elegant, and completely circular. Give the archive and lose the Academy's influence. Refuse the archive and lose 31 diplomats. Contact the Diplomatic Council for intervention, but the council would take 3 days to convene and the deadline was 48 hours. Contact allied military forces, but military response would trigger the Compact's backup contingency, which the message had referenced without specifying. The Compact had done this carefully. They'd built a box with exactly enough room in it to fit the Academy, and they'd spent 40 years making sure all the exits were accounted for. An hour into the meeting, the door opened. Debbie walked in. Sabathrow was not the only person in the room who tracked the entry. Several faculty heads turned, and the dean looked up from the table with the expression of someone who was simultaneously surprised, unsurprised, and evaluating. Debbie had not been invited. She was a student. The emergency faculty meeting was by institutional protocol closed. She also had a tablet in her hand with something displayed on it, and she walked to the front of the room with the same unhurried, list-checking focus she'd had in the atrium on day 1, and she put the tablet on the table in front of the dean. "The communications blackout," she said. 12 minutes. The power relay failed at the same time the embassy district switched to backup ventilation following a routine maintenance alert. The dean looked at the tablet. The maintenance alert, Devi continued, was filed by a team that had Academy contractor credentials. Those credentials were issued 14 months ago. Standard vetting, no flags. She turned the tablet so the others at the table could see it. The contracting company incorporated 17 months ago. The founding registrations list 3 directors who are also directors of 4 other companies that are registered in systems with limited cross-jurisdictional record sharing. She paused. The Reth Compact incorporated a subsidiary in one of those systems 11 years ago. Complete silence in the room. "They built this from the inside," said Oreth, the political systems faculty head, and his voice had the quality of someone recalibrating a mental model mid-sentence. 14 months ago, Devi said, which is when the Academy confirmed its participation in this year's Strategic Council review and published the diplomatic attendee list. The Compact chose their leverage point at the same time the leverage became available. She picked up the tablet. They've also been building a secondary position. The archive transfer. They don't actually want the archive. The room shifted. Even the dean. The archive is the ask, Devi said. Asking for the archive creates a specific set of responses. Internal debate about value. external perception of the academy as compromised regardless of the outcome, diplomatic community anxiety about the institution's neutrality, all of which are useful to a faction trying to reposition itself in a strategic council standing. The 31 diplomats are the mechanism. The archive is the optics. What do they want? The dean asked. A seat at the table, Debbie said. They want to be treated as a party worth negotiating with. Right now, they're not. They're not in the council. They're not recognized as a significant power. They've been building for 40 years, and they're still considered peripheral. This gets them recognition. Either the academy's leadership negotiates with them directly, which elevates their standing, or the academy refuses, and they release the diplomats after the deadline anyway, which they were always going to do, because harming diplomats would destroy the legitimacy they're trying to build, and the story that gets told is that they face down the Verith Academy. The dean said nothing for a moment. Velharan, who had been silent throughout the faculty meeting, said, "You've been working on this since the blackout." "Since about 20 minutes after," Debbie said. "I know what a manufactured crisis looks like." The timing was too clean. "You've seen this before," Velharan said. "Not a question." "My grandmother spent a while in the border systems," Debbie said. "The Compact's model is older than the Compact. It's a pattern." She paused. "There's a version of this in the restricted archive. I can't access the specific case, but the general framework is in the open political theory curriculum." Chapter 11. Professor Ortha's course. Leverage Engineering and Recognition Politics in Non-State Factions. It's a very good chapter. Orth looked at Savithro. Savithro looked at the table. The dean picked up the tablet. She read through the documentation. She had been administering this institution for 93 years, and her expression while reading was the expression of someone who was both absorbing new information and recognizing something she'd already partially understood. If they want recognition, the dean said, then the question is what recognition costs us versus what refusing them costs. And who you use to deliver the answer, Debbie said. The dean looked up. The council has a standing mediation track, Debbie said. Non-binding, low formality, available to any party that requests it. The Compact has never requested it because requesting it as a non-recognized faction would be seen as weak. But if the Academy recommended their inclusion as a party that has demonstrated capacity for organized action, which this is, they get the recognition without the optics of asking for it. And the Academy doesn't negotiate with them directly. You recommend the mediation track. You release a statement about the value of institutional process. The Compact accepts because this is exactly what they wanted, without the part where they had to demand it. She stopped. The diplomats come home. The archive stays intact. The Academy's neutrality is a little shaken, but the institution handled a crisis with institutional tools rather than capitulation or confrontation, which actually reinforces the neutrality long-term. Silence. Extended silence. The kind that happens in rooms full of brilliant minds when a thread has been handed to them, and they are all running it simultaneously, and the tracks are all arriving at the same place. Velharan's expression did the thing again. The thing Savithro had watched him do in the observation gallery. The thing without a clean Salvani classification. "You came to give us the thread," he said. Debbie looked at him. "You have the resources to run it." "I don't. You could have sent this through student channels," the dean said, "as a formal submission. Anonymously, even." Debbie considered this. "I didn't know if there was time for a formal submission." "There isn't," the dean said. She set the tablet down. She looked around the table. Not asking for input. Assessing the room the way an administrator of 93 years assesses a room when a decision has already been shaped and what remains is implementation. We'll proceed with the mediation track recommendation. Orth, draft the statement. Velharan, contact the council's standing mediation office. She looked at Debbie. "You should not be here." "No," Debbie agreed. "You are here, and the information you brought is correct, and we will use it." A pause. "This conversation will not appear in any official record of this meeting." Debbie nodded once. Started for the door. "Student Debbie." The dean's voice was formal in the way of things that are formal, because the person speaking needs a moment of formality before they say the real thing. Debbie stopped. "Your grandmother. When she graduated. I was a junior administrator. I was in the room when she presented her thesis." The dean looked at the table. Looked at Debbie. She said that the difference between a solution and an answer is that a solution involves the people who will have to live with it. I've been teaching that for 60 years. She paused. I didn't give her credit in the curriculum because the file was sealed. Something moved through Devi's face. The adjacent to grief thing and something else alongside it. I'll tell her, she said. Then, a beat later, I'll tell her it finally got used the right way. She left. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then, the dean said Oreth in the tone that means now, and the meeting became purposeful and organized, and the thread began to run the way threads do when the right people have them. The diplomats were released 11 hours later. The Academy's statement recommending the Reth Compact for inclusion in the Council's standing mediation track was published at the same time. It was phrased in the precise, neutral language of institutional process and mentioned the Compact's demonstrated organizational coherence as the basis for the recommendation, which was accurate, if somewhat indirect about the specific demonstration. The Compact accepted within 4 hours. In the strategic analysis community, which dissected these things carefully, the consensus was that the Academy had handled a complicated situation with unusual elegance. A few analysts noted the speed of the resolution. One Salvani commentator wrote a brief piece arguing that the Academy's response suggested internal strategic resources of a higher caliber than its academic reputation alone would imply, and that this was worth noting for any future party considering leverage approaches against the institution. The piece was widely circulated. Nobody in the Academy commented on it officially. Savathro found Devi in the commissary that evening, not in the restricted archive corridor, not running calculations on a side display, just eating in a way humans ate, with visible engagement, as if the food was not merely fuel, as if the act of consuming it had some kind of weight that went beyond nutrition. She sat across from her. Devi looked up. "The diplomats are home," Savathro said. "I know." She pushed something around on her tray. I checked. The dean's statement was published. I saw. Savathro was quiet for a moment. "You could have taken credit." Devi shook her head once, the same way she'd shaken it in the simulation hall, not dismissing the idea, but indicating that it wasn't a relevant consideration, the way you shake your head at a question that doesn't apply to the problem you're actually solving. "The dean handled it," she said. "The faculty handled it. I gave them something that helped. That's different." Vethorin ran the parallel tracks, Savathro said. "In the simulation, you gave him the thread. He confirmed the fuel drift. The team ran the solution. And the record is 89%, Devi said. And the record is 89%, Savathro agreed. "Not attributed to you. Attributed to the team." She picked up something from her tray and ate it without ceremony. The way it should be. Savathro sat with this. All 4 processing layers. The anticipation scent marker had faded, or changed into something she didn't have a clean label for either, something that was in the same family, but further along in the process. Like the difference between expecting to see something and having seen it. "What did your grandmother teach you?" she asked. "Directly, before you came." Devi was quiet for a moment. Not the processing quiet, something else. "She said the Academy teaches you to think about problems in terms of what you can do," she said. She said the thing she had to unlearn after she left was that doing it yourself is sometimes the worst solution. Not because you can't, because when you do it yourself, it ends when you end. When you give it to other people, she stopped. Reorganized the sentence. When you find the people who can run it and you give them the piece they're missing, then it doesn't end when you do. It keeps going. Another pause. She spent 14 years in the border systems doing that. Finding the threads. Handing them to the people who could run them. She didn't start any wars, and she didn't end any. But there are 3 systems that are still. She moved her hand in the gesture that substitutes for a sentence she's decided not to finish. Still okay. Because of threads that are still running. Savathro's layers landed on something they hadn't reached before. Something that was not anticipation anymore. It was something in the Drelkai vocabulary. Actually, a word she hadn't thought of in a long time. Sawachihe. Roughly, the moment you understand that a thing you've been watching has been teaching you all along without your participation. Velharan had been taught by the grandmother. He'd been saying it for 60 years without attribution. The solution style. The way a solution involves the people who live with it. He'd been running a thread for 60 years and hadn't known where it came from. She graduated 60 years ago, Savathro said. Devi ate something else. And the threads are still running. Devi looked up. The forward-facing visual contact, the mild startlement, the thing that showed teeth. She'd say they were always running, she said. She just figured out how to see them. Savithro sat across the commissary table from a 22-year-old human who had handed a crisis solution to a room full of the galaxy's most brilliant minds and then eaten dinner, and she thought about 60 years of a thread running through faculty lectures and diplomatic frameworks and the muscle memory of a very old dean who'd heard one sentence in a thesis presentation and built a teaching philosophy around it without knowing where it came from. She thought about a granddaughter who'd shown up at the Verith Academy with a jacket repaired in 4 places, checked in without fanfare, assessed the atrium's dimensions in case she needed to run, and spent 6 weeks finding the threads. "You're going to graduate," Savithro said. "That's the plan," Devi said. And then? Devi looked at her tray for a moment. Then at the commissary around them, the cluster of Drelkai students running a post-session analysis, the Salvani debating something with elegant precision, a small group of mixed species sharing food with the slightly awkward conviviality of people who are still learning each other's customs and finding it interesting rather than difficult. "There are more border systems," she said, "and more threads that need finding." She pushed her tray to the side. "My grandmother said the Verith Academy was the best place she'd ever found for learning to see them. Because you're surrounded by the best minds in the galaxy, and the best minds in the galaxy will show you, very clearly, exactly where they're looking." She paused, which tells you exactly where they're not. She stood up, picked up her bag. She also said the commissary food here was excellent. She added, with the same tone she'd used to note that the shuttle food was bad. She was right about that part. She nodded once, the way she nodded at the archive door, and walked back through the commissary with her even, unhurried step past the Drelkai analysis cluster and the Salvani debate and the mixed species table finding each other's customs interesting, and was gone. Savithro updated the integration notes that evening. The field for social integration progress had been blinking for 6 weeks. She filled it in. Student has integrated successfully. Social network established across multiple species. Faculty engagement positive. No concerns identified. She moved to the administrative text field. The 3 previous entries were there. She read them. Then, she wrote a 4th. "I've been teaching integration for 214 cycles. In 214 cycles, I have watched students arrive. I have watched them struggle and adapt and find their place in the institution's architecture. I have watched some of them become extraordinary. I have filed their integration reports and moved on. This is the first time I have ended a student's integration period suspecting that the student has been integrating me. I checked my own counseling notes from the last 6 weeks. She has twice, in what appeared to be casual conversation, handed me something, a framing, a way of looking at a problem I've been stuck on, and then said nothing more about it and changed the subject. The problems got solved. I attributed the solutions to my own processing. I don't know what to do with this information. I think that might be the point." She closed the integration notes. Outside her office window, the Academy's central spire caught the light from 3 star sources and scattered it in colors no single planet sky had ever produced. Somewhere in the corridors below, 1,144 students were working, arguing, eating, and learning to see the galaxy. One of them was looking for threads. Savithro suspected she'd already found several. She suspected she was one of them. She was not, she noted, as unsettled by this as she probably should have been. The Drelkai word for it was Sevediatre. The moment you understand a thing has been teaching you all along. The humans, she thought, probably had a word for it too. She would ask tomorrow. She was already looking forward to the answer.